The morning was cold, and a thick mist hung low over the dilapidated neighborhood. Hannah, wrapped in layers of worn clothes, moved slowly behind the grocery store, her tired eyes scanning the dumpster for anything edible. She found a half-spoiled loaf of bread, its edges hardened and stale, but it was better than nothing. As she reached out to grab it, a faint cry pierced the stillness of the morning. Hannah paused, her heart skipping a beat. The cry was soft, almost drowned by the rustling leaves and the distant hum of traffic. She followed the sound, her breath visible in the chilly air. There, nestled between two overflowing trash bins, was a basket. Inside, a newborn baby lay, shivering and crying. Shock and empathy collided within Hannah. She knelt down, her hands trembling as she reached into the basket. The baby's tiny fingers grasped her own, and Hannah felt a wave of emotion wash over her. Her life had been a series of harsh realities and unfulfilled dreams. But in that moment her heart softened. "Shoo, it's all right," she whispered, her voice cracking. She gently lifted the baby, cradling the fragile body against her chest. The baby's cries quieted, replaced by soft whimpers as Hannah's warmth enveloped her. Hannah glanced around, half expecting someone to come running, claiming the child. But the alley remained silent, indifferent to the life-changing moment unfolding within it. She knew the responsibility that came with taking the baby. Her life was already a constant struggle for survival, and adding a newborn to the mix seemed impossible. Yet, the thought of leaving the baby alone in the cold was unthinkable. As she stood up, Hannah's mind raced. She needed to find food, warmth, and shelter for the baby, all while grappling with her own precarious existence. The grocery store owner had always been kind to her. Perhaps he could help. She hurried inside, the bell above the door jingling softly. Mr. Rodriguez, a graying man with kind eyes, looked up from the counter. "Morning, Hannah. What brings you in so early?" Hannah hesitated, then revealed the baby nestled in her coat. "I found her in the alley, Mr. Rodriguez. I don't know what to do." Mr. Rodriguez's eyes widened with concern. He came around the counter, peering at the baby. "She's so small and cold. We need to get her warm and fed. Here, take this." He handed Hannah a carton of milk and a clean towel. "Thank you," Hannah whispered, her gratitude palpable. She wrapped the baby in the towel and fed her small sips of milk, her hands steady despite the turmoil within her. Back in her small shack, Hannah laid the baby on her makeshift bed, tucking blankets around her to keep her warm. The baby's cries had subsided, replaced by soft, rhythmic breathing. Hannah watched her for a moment, her heart swelling with a fierce protectiveness she hadn't known she possessed. "What am I going to do with you?" she murmured. The baby's peaceful expression was her only answer. Hannah sat down, her back against the rough wooden wall, and closed her eyes. Memories of her own childhood flashed before her, moments of pain and abandonment that she had tried to forget. She'd been alone for so long, but now, with this tiny life depending on her, something shifted within her. She couldn't abandon the baby as she had been abandoned. She had to find a way to care for her, to give her a chance at a better life. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the cracks in the shack's walls, Hannah felt a glimmer of hope. She looked at the baby, her lips forming a gentle smile. "Emmanuel A," she whispered. "That will be your name. Emmanuel, my little gift." The name felt right, a symbol of new beginnings and the fragile hope she held onto. Hannah knew the road ahead would be difficult, but as she cradled Emmanuel in her arms, she felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. She would fight for this child no matter the cost. Hannah's small shack was cluttered but functional. The walls, though worn, had been reinforced with cardboard to keep the wind at bay. The makeshift heater in the corner radiated a small but steady warmth, casting a faint glow that illuminated the room. Hannah moved quickly, her movements purposeful despite the exhaustion etched on her face. "Shoo, it's okay, little one," she murmured as she laid Emmanuel on a pile of old blankets that served as a makeshift changing area. The baby squirmed and whimpered, but Hannah's gentle cooing soon calmed her. With practiced hands, she fashioned a diaper out of an old shirt, securing it with strips of cloth. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. "Just a bit longer, sweetheart," Hannah whispered, smoothing Emmanuel's tiny brow. She walked to a small shelf and retrieved a bottle. The milk, donated by the kind store owner Mr. Rodriguez, was a rare luxury. Hannah carefully poured it into the bottle, testing the temperature on her wrist before offering it to Emmanuel. The baby latched on eagerly, her small hands gripping the bottle. As Emmanuel drank, Hannah watched her with a mixture of awe and determination. This child, abandoned and vulnerable, had given her a renewed sense of purpose. She sat beside Emmanuel, gently stroking her cheek. Hannah's thoughts drifted back to her own childhood. She saw flashes of her stepfather's angry face, the sting of his hand against her skin, and the cold, impersonal walls of the orphanage where she had spent so many years. Those memories were a stark contrast to the tender scene before her. Hannah remembered the night she had cried herself to sleep, longing for a mother's touch, a father's protection. She had learned early on that the world was a harsh place, one where trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. But here, in this moment, with Emmanuel cradled in her arms, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. As Emmanuel finished the bottle, Hannah lifted her to her shoulder, gently patting her back. The baby let out a small burp, followed by a contented sigh. Hannah smiled, a rare and genuine expression that lit up her tired features. She rocked Emanuele gently, humming a lullaby she barely remembered from her own childhood. The memories continued to flood back, unbidden. She saw herself as a little girl, hiding under the kitchen table, as her stepfather raged above her. She remembered the cold, institutional feel of the orphanage, the way the other children had teased her for her red hair and freckles. These fragments of her past, both painful and sweet, intertwined with the present as she held Emmanuel. Hannah knew that she couldn't change her own past, but she could shape Emmanuel's future. The room grew warmer as the heater continued its steady hum. Emmanuel's eyes drooped, her small body relaxing into sleep. Hannah laid her down gently, tucking the blankets around her. She sat beside the makeshift crib, watching the rise and fall of Emmanuel's tiny chest. In that moment, the world outside their small sanctuary seemed distant and unimportant. The morning light filtered through the cracks again, heralding a new day. Hannah woke with renewed determination, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Holding Emmanuel close, she stepped outside, ready to begin their journey together. The streets were familiar yet daunting. Hannah walked past the spots where she had once begged, now carrying Emmanuel strapped to her chest in a makeshift sling. The baby's gentle breathing provided a small comfort as Hannah navigated through the bustling city. "Morning, Hannah," called out Mrs. Lopez from the corner store. Hannah nodded, her eyes scanning the street for any signs of work. She had to find ways to provide for Emmanuel, even if it meant doing the hardest jobs. Her first stop was a local cafe. The owner, Mr. Rufus, knew her well. "Got any work for me today?" Hannah asked, her voice steady despite the uncertainty. Mr. Rufus looked at her, then at the baby. "I need someone to wash dishes. You up for it?" Hannah nodded, adjusting Emmanuel in the sling. "I'll manage." The cafe kitchen was small and hot. Hannah plunged her hands into the soapy water, scrubbing dishes as quickly as she could. Emmanuel stirred and Hannah paused to rock her gently, humming a lullaby. The baby's eyes fluttered open and closed, finally settling into a peaceful sleep. Despite the relentless pace, Hannah felt a sense of purpose. Each plate she washed, each floor she scrubbed, brought her closer to providing a better life for Emmanuel. But the hours were long and her body was beginning to betray her. A cough that had started as a mild irritation now racked her chest, leaving her breathless. "Take a break, Hannah," Mr. Rufus said, his tone more sympathetic than usual. "You look exhausted." "I'm fine," Hannah replied, forcing a smile. "Just a few more dishes." Mr. Rufus shook his head but didn't press further. Hannah's determination was both her greatest strength and her biggest weakness. She couldn't afford to rest, not when Emmanuel's future depended on her. After finishing at the cafe, Hannah moved on to her next job, cleaning houses in a nearby neighborhood. Mrs. Gonzalez, one of her regular employers, was a stern woman but fair. She noticed Hannah's pallor and the way she struggled to hide her coughs. "Hannah, you need to take care of yourself," Mrs. Gonzalez said, handing her a glass of water. "You can't help the baby if you're sick," Hannah nodded, grateful for the concern but knowing she had no choice. "I'll be fine, Mrs. Gonzalez. just need to get through today." Mrs. Gonzalez watched her for a moment, then nodded. "Well, if you need anything, let me know." The day dragged on, each task more grueling than the last. By the time Hannah finished, the sun was setting. She made her way back to the shack, her body aching with fatigue. The journey felt longer than usual, every step a test of her resolve. Inside the shack, the familiar warmth of the makeshift heater greeted her. She gently laid Emmanuel down, the baby's innocent smile a balm for her weary soul. Hannah sat down heavily, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The day's efforts had taken a toll, but the sight of Emmanuel made it all worthwhile. As night fell, Hannah rocked Emmanuel to sleep, the baby's gentle breathing a lullaby of its own. She whispered softly, "We'll get through this, my little one, together." The moonlight filtered through the cracks in the shack, casting a soft glow on mother and child. Hannah felt a flicker of hope amidst the exhaustion, a reminder that despite the hardships, she had something precious to fight for. 5 years later, life had become a bit more stable for Hannah and Emmanuel. They lived in a small but cozy apartment where laughter often echoed through the rooms. Emmanuel had grown into a lively, well-mannered child, her smile a constant source of joy for Hannah. Though they weren't wealthy, they had enough to get by, and that was enough for Hannah. One day, after a particularly severe coughing fit that left her breathless and weak, Hannah decided it was time to see a doctor. She had been dismissing her symptoms as mere exhaustion, but this felt different, more alarming. With Emmanuel in tow, she made her way to a small, overcrowded clinic in their neighborhood. The clinic was a chaotic place, filled with anxious patients and the smell of antiseptic hanging thick in the air. Hannah waited patiently, trying to keep Emmanuel entertained with a tattered picture book. Her daughter's laughter was a small comfort amidst the uncertainty. "Hannah Silver!" The nurse called out, and Hannah stood, lifting Emmanuel onto her hip. They were led to a stark, impersonal examination room. The walls were bare, and the fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow. Hannah's heart pounded as the doctor entered, a man with tired eyes and a gentle demeanor. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked, his voice calm and professional. "I've been coughing a lot and it's getting worse," Hannah replied, her voice betraying her anxiety. "I feel so tired all the time, but I thought it was just because of work." The doctor nodded, asking more questions and conducting a thorough examination. He listened to her breathing, his expression growing more serious with each passing moment. After a series of tests, he asked Hannah to wait while he reviewed the results. Hannah sat in the examination room, her mind racing. She held Emmanuel close, the little girl sensing her mother's unease and hugging her tightly in return. The wait seemed endless, and Hannah's thoughts spiraled into fear and uncertainty. What if it was something serious? What would happen to Emmanuel if she couldn't take care of her? Finally, the doctor returned, his face grave. "Hannah, I'm afraid I have some difficult news. The tests indicate that you have advanced stage cancer." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Hannah felt the world tilt around her. She clutched Emmanuel tighter, her mind struggling to process the information. "Cancer? How bad is it?" The doctor sighed, his expression sympathetic. "It's quite advanced. We need to start treatment immediately. But I understand your financial situation might make things complicated." Hannah's thoughts whirled. Treatment? How could she afford that? And what would happen to Emmanuel if she couldn't work? The doctor continued, outlining potential treatment options. But Hannah could barely hear him over the roar of her own fears. After the appointment, Hannah walked outside, the clinic's doors closing behind her with a finality that felt crushing. She found a bench and sat down heavily, Emmanuel on her lap. The weight of the diagnosis pressed down on her, tears streaming down her face. Emmanuel looked up, her eyes wide with concern. "Mama? Why are you crying?" she asked, her voice small and worried. Hannah forced a smile, brushing the tears away. "It's okay, sweetheart. Mama's just a little scared. But we're going to be all right. I promise." Inside, Hannah's turmoil was immense. The fear of what would happen to Emmanuel if she couldn't be there for her was almost too much to bear. But as she looked at her daughter, she felt a steely resolve harden within her. She couldn't let this illness take away the life she had built for them. She had to find a way to ensure Emmanuel was taken care of no matter what. With Emmanuel's small hand in hers, Hannah walked home, the path ahead uncertain but filled with determination. The days that followed were a blur of routine and growing concern. Hannah's small apartment, once a place of modest comfort, now felt like a battlefield. Hannah's health deteriorated rapidly. Her cough, once an annoyance, became a relentless torment. Each hacking fit left her weaker, and the first time she coughed up blood, she felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, quickly hiding the evidence before Emmanuel could see. "Mama, are you okay?" Emmanuel asked one evening, her wide eyes filled with innocent concern. She stood in the doorway, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Hannah forced a smile, her heart breaking at the worry in her daughter's eyes. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little tired." Emmanuel nodded slowly, not entirely convinced, but willing to accept her mother's reassurances for now. Hannah turned away, biting back the urge to cry. She had to stay strong for Emmanuel's sake. The days blurred into weeks, and Hannah's condition worsened. She debated seeking help from social services, but was haunted by the fear of losing Emmanuel to the system. She had heard too many stories of children being taken away, and the thought of being separated from her daughter was unbearable. One afternoon, Mrs. Hernandez, a kind neighbor who lived down the hall, knocked on their door. Hannah opened it, her face pale and drawn. Mrs. Hernandez took one look at her and frowned. "Hannah, you don't look well. Are you all right?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine concern. "I'm fine really," Hannah replied, forcing a weak smile. Mrs. Hernandez wasn't convinced. "You know, if you need anything, I'm here to help. Don't hesitate to ask." Hannah appreciated the offer, but declined politely. She couldn't bear the thought of being seen as a burden, and she feared the pity in Mrs. Hernandez's eyes. "Thank you, but we're managing. It's just a little cold." As the door closed, Hannah leaned against it, her legs trembling. She knew she needed help, but the fear of losing Emmanuel kept her paralyzed. The weight of her secret grew heavier each day. That night, after putting Emmanuel to bed, Hannah sat by her crib, singing softly. The familiar lullabies, usually a comfort, now felt like a cruel reminder of the fragility of their situation. Tears streamed down her face as she watched Emmanuel sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. The reality of her situation pressed down on her like a vice. She couldn't hide the truth much longer, and the thought of leaving Emmanuel alone in the world was a constant torment. Hannah's mind raced with plans and possibilities, but each one seemed more hopeless than the last. She reached out and gently stroked Emmanuel's hair, her heart breaking at the thought of not being there to watch her grow up. "I'm so sorry, my love," she whispered through her tears. "I wish I could promise you more." The room was silent, save for the sound of Emmanuel's breathing and Hannah's muffled sobs. The walls seemed to close in around her, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Hannah felt a profound sense of despair, but also a flicker of determination. She had to find a way to protect Emmanuel, no matter the cost. It was a cold, gray afternoon. The air was thick with the promise of rain, and the sky hung low over Hannah's small apartment. Inside, the home was filled with the sound of Emmanuel's playful babbling. She was busy with her toys, creating an imaginary world on the living room floor. The warmth of the makeshift heater created a contrast to the chill outside, casting a gentle glow over the room. Hannah sat at the small kitchen table, sipping a cup of tea. The tea was weak, but its warmth was comforting. She watched Emmanuel with a soft smile, trying to ignore the persistent ache in her chest. Every day was a struggle, but moments like these made it worthwhile. Emmanuel's laughter was a balm to her weary soul. A sudden noise outside broke the tranquility. Hannah looked up, frowning as she heard the sound of a car engine. It wasn't the usual hum of the neighbors' vehicles. This one was different, smoother, more refined. She stood up and peered out of the window, her breath catching in her throat. A sleek, luxurious car had pulled up in front of their building. The kind of car that didn't belong in their modest neighborhood. The door opened and a well-dressed man stepped out. He was tall, with dark hair neatly combed back, and he moved with an air of confidence that immediately put Hannah on edge. "Mama, who's that?" Emmanuel asked, looking up from her toys. I don't know, sweetheart, Hannah replied, her voice tense. Stay here and keep playing, okay? Emmanuel nodded, sensing her mother's unease. Hannah took a deep breath and opened the door, stepping out into the cold. The man was already approaching, his polished shoes clicking on the pavement. He stopped a few feet away, giving her a polite nod. Hannah Silva, he asked, his voice smooth and cultured. Yes, Hannah replied warily. Who are you? My name is John Montero, he said, extending a hand. Hannah hesitated before shaking it, her grip firm despite her anxiety. I'm here about your daughter, Emmanuel. Hannah's heart skipped a beat, her mind raced, fear and suspicion warring within her. What about her? John took a deep breath, his expression serious. May I come in? This is a sensitive matter, and I'd prefer to discuss it in private. Hannah glanced back at the apartment, then at John. Everything about him screamed wealth and authority, two things that had no place in her world. But there was something else in his eyes, a hint of desperation, a plea for understanding. She nodded reluctantly and stepped aside to let him in. Inside, John looked around, taking in the modest furnishings and the warmth of the home. Emmanuel looked up from her toys, curiosity shining in her eyes. Mama, who's this? This is Mr. Montero, Hannah said, her voice strained. He's here to talk to us. John smiled kindly at Emmanuel, then turned back to Hannah. Thank you for letting me in. I understand this must be confusing and perhaps alarming, but I assure you, I'm not here to cause any harm. Then why are you here? Hannah asked, crossing her arms protectively over her chest. John sighed, looking genuinely troubled. I've been searching for my daughter for years. Her mother, Paulina, and I were deeply in love. But circumstances tore us apart. Paulina disappeared, and I've spent every moment since trying to find her and our child. Hannah's heart pounded as she listened, the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place. Paulina? Emmanuel's mother? Yes, John said, his voice softening. She passed away a few years ago. It's taken me this long to trace Emmanuel to you. Hannah felt a surge of conflicting emotions, fear, hope, and a fierce protectiveness for her daughter. How do I know you're telling the truth? I understand your skepticism, John said. That's why I'm asking for a genetic test, to prove that Emmanuel is my daughter. I know this is a lot to take in, but I need to be sure. And if she is my daughter, I want to be part of her life. Hannah looked at Emmanuel, who was watching them with wide, curious eyes. The thought of losing her daughter was unbearable, but the idea of giving Emmanuel a better future was equally compelling. She turned back to John, her voice steady but filled with emotion. And what if she is your daughter? What happens then? John met her gaze, his eyes sincere. I'm not here to take her away from you, Hannah. I can see how much you love her, and it's clear she's happy here. But I want to help. I want to provide for her, to ensure she has everything she needs. And I want to get to know her, to be a part of her life. Hannah felt tears welling up, but she blinked them back. She couldn't afford to be weak now. All right, we'll do the test. But I need you to understand something. Emmanuel is my daughter, no matter what the results say. I've raised her, I've loved her, and I won't let anyone take her from me. John nodded, respect evident in his eyes. I understand. And I promise that's not my intention. I just want to know my daughter and to support both of you in any way I can. The next few days were a whirlwind. The genetic test was arranged quickly, John's resources ensuring there was no delay. Hannah felt a mixture of dread and anticipation as they waited for the results. She couldn't help but wonder how this would change their lives. But she held on to her promise to protect Emmanuel above all else. When the day of the results arrived, John returned to their apartment. Hannah's heart pounded as she opened the door. He held an envelope in his hand, his expression a mix of hope and anxiety. Shall we? He asked, his voice trembling slightly. Hannah nodded, leading him inside. Emmanuel was playing quietly in the corner, unaware of the significance of the moment. John opened the envelope, his hands shaking. He read the results, then looked up at Hannah, his eyes filled with tears. She's my daughter, he whispered, his voice breaking, his hand trembling slightly. Emmanuel is my daughter. Hannah felt a wave of relief and fear wash over her. The confirmation was both a blessing and a challenge. She looked at John, seeing the genuine love and longing in his eyes. He wasn't a threat, he was a father who had found his child. "Thank you, Hannah Johnson." The gate clicked closed behind me, and I started walking toward my sister's car. I took a deep breath. The air where I was walking was the same air that was on the other side of the wall, but somehow it smelled fresher and sweeter. Marcy gave me a hug and said, "Before I take you home, is there anything you want to do? Any place in particular you want to go?" "Yeah, I guess there is. I'd love to have a cold beer." "You got it. What bar do you want to go to?" "You bet." As we drove away from the gray stone walls, I thought back to what had put me there. It was a divorce, a very, very nasty divorce. It was an event you would never have imagined on that beautiful July day when Amy walked down the aisle toward me on the arm of her father. Amy and I had been a pair since the second grade. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that we wouldn't end up married. We were forever. It was a storybook romance that was supposed to have a fairy tale ending, and they lived happily ever after attached to it. We agreed to wait until after we had graduated college to get married, and also to hold off on having kids until we were 30. We wanted to go places and do things before we settled down. It wasn't all pure storybook, of course. Twice, once in 11th grade and again in our sophomore year in college, Amy felt that she should know what other guys were like. The period in high school lasted only 3 weeks. Amy came back and said she was sorry and that what she did was dumb. I dated 5 guys and they were all a-holes. I had the best and I almost screwed it up. I was so busy with classes and sports that I gave no thought to going out with other girls. Both times it hurt, but when she did it again in college I got my back up and said to myself, "Okay, you want to find out about other guys? I'll just go out and find out what other girls are like." I quickly found out that a lot of other girls were not as insistent as Amy, that they walked down the aisle as virgins. In a 5-week period, Bev Holbrook relieved me of my virginity. Nancy Newbert introduced me to the joy of oral sex, and Irina Collins introduced me to other ways of sex. Pauline French taught me how best to do 69. The only fly in the ointment was the thought in the back of my mind that Amy was receiving the same education. It was double-standard thinking and I knew it, but I still felt that I should have been the first one to do those things with Amy. One night, about 6 weeks after Amy went off to see what other guys were like, I came home from class and found Amy sitting on the front porch steps. It was a repeat of the high school episode. I had the best all along and didn't realize it. "Forgive me," she said. I loved her, had loved her damn near forever, so of course I forgave her. We never spoke of what we had done while apart, but when I tried to get sexual with her, she told me she wanted to wait until we were married, and I didn't push it. Still, it was no surprise to me when she didn't turn out to be a virgin when we went to our marriage bed. I didn't mention it, but I could tell that she was aware that I knew I wasn't her first. We both found good jobs in our chosen fields, and the next 4 years were pretty good ones. I had to travel some with my job, but it wasn't all that often, and the trips were never longer than 3 days. It was the day after her 26th birthday when Amy told me that she was pregnant. I was surprised since we had agreed to wait until we were 30 to start our family. She told me that according to her doctor, the drugs she took when she had the flu had negated her birth control pills. 9 months later, Brian Lewis joined us. Amy was only off work for 6 weeks. The place she worked had a daycare center in the building, so she started back to work and took Brian with her. 9 months later, she said that now we had started the family she wanted to have. She wanted the next one so the two would be close together and easier to raise. I didn't much care, so I said okay, and 6 weeks later, she told me I was going to be a daddy again. In her 8th month, she said that she thought 2 kids were enough, and would I mind if she had her tubes tied. My attitude was that it was her body, and if she didn't want to spend 9 months walking around pregnant, who was I to say she had to? A month later, we were blessed with Susan Marie. As with Brian, Amy was only off work for 6 weeks, and then she went back to work, taking both babies with her. Over the next 6 years, Amy and I were both promoted twice, and we were making pretty good money between us. We seemed to be the perfect couple. We rarely argued over anything, and we were still pretty active in the bedroom. We were averaging 3 times a week, which I was led to believe was pretty good when compared to other couples with children married the same length of time. We had similar likes and dislikes, enjoyed going places and doing things with each other, and were happy to see each other when we got home from work every day. But the happy home life and loving couple thing was a lie, as I found out one day in July. I had flown to Denver to visit one of our suppliers and see if I could find out why they were having trouble meeting their delivery dates. It was scheduled as a 3-day trip, but when I got there I found that the company had been ceased earlier in the day by the IRS for non-payment of payroll taxes. It turned out that the company had been in financial trouble for some time. I turned around and headed back to the airport to catch the next flight home. It never occurred to me to call Amy and let her know I was coming home early, which was a good thing because if I had called, I might never have found out what I did. I got home at 5:20, and Amy wasn't home from work yet. I thought about starting dinner, but then decided to take Amy and the kids out for dinner. I was in the room that we had set up as a home office when I heard the garage door opener start to run, which told me that Amy was home. By the time I went through all of the motions to save my work, and then back out of the computer program I was in, Amy was coming into the house. I was just opening the office door when I heard Amy say, "Stop that," and a man's voice say, "You don't want me to stop it and you know it. Matter of fact, I don't even want to wait until we can get to the bedroom. I think I want to do over the back of your couch. Jesus, you have to be the horniest man I've ever known. Yes, sweetie, and you love it. Well, it is kind of nice over the back of the couch. Do I get to take my panties off or are you just going to push them to the side? Take them off. I almost rubbed my meat raw the last time when I just pushed them aside. We definitely don't want to hurt your meat." There was a break in the conversation, then "Yeah, God, yes, that feels so good," followed by the sound of flesh slapping flesh, along with all the moans and sounds from Amy that I was so familiar with, sounds that had me dying inside. I took out my cell phone, set it to take pictures, and then headed toward the living room. I knew who I was going to see when I walked in on them, Amy's supervisor at work, who I'd met at Amy's company Christmas parties, picnics, and other company social events. Amy had no way of knowing that I was home. I had dropped my car off at the dealership for a factory recall on the brakes on my way to the airport, and it wouldn't be ready until the next day, so I had taken a cab home from the airport. They were going to be very surprised when I walked in on them. I got 5 good pictures of them before they realized I was in the room, and I got 3 more as they frantically pulled apart. I dropped my phone into my pocket and headed for him. I read what I planned to do on my face, and unfortunately, at least from my standpoint, I wasn't between him and the door. Fortunately, at least for him, he hadn't taken off his pants to screw Amy, and instead had just unzipped and started with her. Thus, he was able to turn and head for the door before I could get to him. I still might have gotten my hands on him, but as I went by Amy, she stuck out her foot and tripped me. By the time I regained my balance, he was out the door and gone. I turned and walked past Amy into the kitchen, got the phone book out of the cupboard where we kept it, and paged through it until I came to Harold Bartram. I picked up the phone and was punching numbers into it when Amy walked into the room and asked, "What are you doing?" "Call in Janet Bartram so I can share the news with her." Amy hurried over and pulled the phone cord out of the wall socket as she said, "Don't do that, you will just cause problems." "You don't think we already have problems? I mean, between Hal and Janet, it's okay for Hal to screw up my life, but I have to be careful not to screw up his. It isn't that, there's no need to hurt Janet. She's an innocent part of here, I don't see it that way. She is married to a cheating a-hole and she needs to know it. If she accepts it, fine, but starting now I intend to make his life a living hell. I'll start by telling Janet and offering to show her the pictures if she would like to see them. Then I'm going to get a lawyer and go after him at work. I'm sure that your company has a policy and procedures manual, and I'll bet there's something in there about a supervisor having sexual relations with a subordinate. Then I'm going looking for him, and when I catch him, I'm going to beat him half to death. You don't want to do any of that because it will cost you too much. How do you see that? You go to Janet and she kicks him out, and I'll kick you out and move him in here with me and our kids. You file suit against our company, and I'll end up getting fired along with Hal. And with no job, that just means that I will screw you in the divorce and get huge alimony and child support. You go find him and beat him up and you'll go to jail for assault. The best thing for you to do is forget all that and just get on with our lives. You have to be kidding. Get on with our lives after what I've just discovered? Why not? Hal and I have been getting together for a long time and it has never hurt us. We have a good life. I've been a great wife to you. We get along great and I do love you. You can screw that a hole and then tell me you love me. Why not? It is true. All Hal is to me is sex, damn good sex, but just sex. Nothing like adding insult to injury. I catch you cheating and you tell me I'm no good in the bedroom. I didn't say that you were no good in the bedroom. Then why are you screwing other men? I'm not screwing other men. I've only been with Hal since we have been married. You know what I mean. Look honey, you are a great guy. You are a great husband and father and you are okay in the bedroom, but Hal gives me something that you can't. Marvelous. Simply marvelous. I'm a great husband and father, but I'm only okay in the bedroom. That is just so good to know. I didn't mean for it to sound that way. There is nothing wrong with you in the bedroom. We have a great sex life. Not good enough, apparently. You are fine, baby. I swear to you that you are just fine. Fine, but Hal offers me something I need that you just can't give me. Oh yeah. And just what would that be? Size. Hal has 11 inches, and those 11 inches do things for me that you just can't do. It shouldn't matter, honey. We've had a perfect life right up until today. There is no reason that we can't continue to have a good life, as long as I don't mind you playing with 11 inches from time to time. It hasn't hurt us, honey. It has been going on for years. We will be okay. I promise. I just shook my head and said, you are really out of it if you think we can continue after what I saw. But I do have to admit to some curiosity. You say it has been going on for years. Just how many years and how did it start? It started before I met Hal. It started when I was in college. We split up because I wanted to see what other guys might be like. One of the first I hooked up with had 10 inches and it drove me wild. Apparently, guys with big equipment share information, and the guy with 10 inches told some other guys about the girl who went wild over his big tool. I went through 5 of them and loved every bit of what I got from them before I decided that you were the one I needed to be with. That brings up 2 questions. First, why didn't you marry one of them if you were so hung up on big equipment? Because they were all a-holes. They all seemed to think that a big tool was all they needed, and the girl should be grateful for the experience. I needed more than a stuffed feeling and I loved you, so I walked away from them. The second question is, after you had given up your virginity to a big dick a-hole and had been with several of them for almost 6 weeks, why did you tell me we couldn't have sex until we got married? I loved you and I knew I loved you, but I was down on men in general after my experience with the 5. I just didn't feel like having sex. It wasn't fair to you, but that was my thinking at the time. Things were fine until one of the company Christmas parties you couldn't make because you were on a business trip to Seattle. I think it was. Anyway, I had a few more drinks than I should have and was feeling a little playful when Hal danced me under the mistletoe and kissed me. I felt his hard tool poking into my leg. Like I said, I was in a playful mood, so I did a Mae West impression and said, "Is that a roll of quarters in your pocket, or are you just glad to see me?" Hal said, and I remember that he had been drinking also, that it was a lot bigger than a roll of quarters. So no, there's no chance that we will be getting back together and working things out. Just get the ball rolling and serve her as soon as you can. Have her in-house served at work if you can arrange it. Amy was not smiling when I got home. You just had to do it. We could have worked things out and gotten by it, but you had to go and tell Janet. She kicked him out of the house and it's all because of you, not because of me, Amy. It's because of what you were doing. And I'm sorry that she kicked him out. It will just make it that much harder to find him. When I do, I can promise you that that huge meat you're so in love with isn't going to be working it that well for a while. Just remember that I warned you, Rob. That night, I got up at 3 o'clock while everyone else in the house was sleeping. Using Q-tips, I swabbed the cheeks of my sleeping children. I dropped the swabs off at a local lab on my way to work, and offered to pay extra if there was any way the tests could be expedited. The words, "Just remember that I warned you, Rob," from Amy, echoed in my mind as I was at the bank when the doors to the lobby opened at 9 o'clock. I cleaned out all of the accounts in the safe deposit box and went down the street to another bank to open an account in my name only. I'd have to account for it later on in the divorce, but at least I would have the funds to make the house payments and take care of the kids. Back at the office, I had another thought and called to cancel all of our joint credit cards so Amy couldn't run up the balances with cash advances. It was a good thing I had done that because when I got home that night, a man walked up to me, handed me an envelope and said, "You were served. I would suggest you move at least 500 feet from this house, because there is a temporary restraining order in that envelope." I opened the envelope, and there was indeed a restraining order saying that I couldn't come within 500 feet of the house, Amy, or the kids. Her attorney obviously worked a lot faster than Mike, but I guess in his defense he didn't know that speed was required, and neither had I. I looked up at the house and saw Amy standing there smirking at me. I backed the car out of the driveway, drove down to the corner and called Mike on his cell. I updated him and asked how I could get into the house to retrieve my things. He told me he had some friends in the sheriff's department and would see what he could do and call me back. While I had him on the phone, I told him to change the divorce from irreconcilable differences to adultery, and to go after Bartram and Amy and Bartram's company with a vengeance. "Burn them, Mike, burn them bad." He called me back in 15 minutes and told me that 2 deputies would be there within a half hour to ensure I gained access to the house. However, until he could get someone from the court to make further arrangements, all I would be able to remove from the house would be my clothes and toiletries. 20 minutes later, 2 patrol cars pulled up in front of the house. I started my car, drove, and parked behind them. They introduced themselves and told me to stay where I was until they called me. Then they walked up to the house and rang the bell. Amy answered, and after a moment of talking, the deputies waved me forward. They cautioned me that I could only take clothes and toiletries, and then I followed them into the house. As I was walking toward the stairs, I glanced into the kitchen and saw that the kids weren't there, but Hal was sitting at the kitchen table with a beer in front of him, a beer that I had bought and paid for. It was all I could do to keep myself from going after him, but it would have been stupid with 2 deputies right there. Amy followed us upstairs and stood in the doorway, watching me pack. It was childish of me, but I couldn't resist. Without looking her way, I said, "You blew it, Amy. You really screwed up this time." I spent most of the day at the office thinking about us, and I finally decided that we could sit down and work things out. "After all, you did swear that you loved me." "Some love, Amy, mental cruelty, a restraining order, no chance for us now." "Amy, think about that. After I leave, we were hours away from staying together, but you screwed it up, and Hal sitting in the kitchen drinking my beer put the final nail in it." I closed the suitcase, turned and walked out of the house. The next day, Amy called me at work. "In light of what you said at the house last night, I'd like to sit down and talk with you." "Not a chance in hell, Amy. What you did to me yesterday, plus how sitting in the house you locked me out of, ended any chance for us. Besides, I can't sit down and talk with you. You set it up so I can't come within 500 feet of you, remember? Goodbye, Amy." 2 days later, I was back at the house with 2 people from the court who would supervise the removal of my things. The entire time I was there, Amy kept asking me to sit down and talk with her, but I ignored her right up until I was taking the last load out to the U-Haul. We were in the bedroom, and she was babbling that we could work things out if I would just talk with her. I motioned her over, and when she came, I pointed to the master bedroom bath area. She saw what I was pointing at and her face fell. On the counter were a man's toiletries and they weren't mine. I didn't use Old Spice or Men and Speed Stick. Goodbye, Amy. Just remember that what is coming you brought on yourself and it could have been avoided. Things moved quickly after that. Amy was served at work with papers countersuing her on the grounds of adultery. Hal was served also at work with papers suing him for alienation of affections. Their employer was sued for not enforcing the portion of their policies and procedures manual pertaining to relationships between supervisors and subordinates, resulting in the dissolution of my marriage. 3 days later, both Hal and Amy were fired. Hal, being Amy's supervisor, was screwed. Amy fought her termination, claiming that Hal threatened to cost her her job if she didn't give in to him. The company didn't buy it and upheld her termination. So, Amy got her lawyer to sue them for wrongful termination. She and Hal must have agreed that Amy's claiming what she did was the way to go, because while all of it was going on, they were still living in our house. 3 weeks after having me served, we had the hearing on extending the temporary restraining order, and the judge denied it, chastising Amy's lawyer for even filing it. A week later we had the preliminary hearing on the divorce. Mike warned me that things were not going to go in my favor. They will almost certainly give Amy temporary custody of the children and full use of the house until the terms of the divorce can be worked out. You will be required to keep up the house payments and pay the utilities. You will also likely be hit with temporary alimony and child support. Her attorney is also pressing to get the money you took out of the accounts, and I'm sure the judge will bring that up. I handed him an envelope and said, this might have an effect on the child support issue. He opened it, read what was inside and said, Rob, I'm so sorry for you. Any idea who the real father is? I bet Amy's lying about their house. It may have no effect on this hearing because it is just a preliminary hearing, and Child Protective Services is going to want to verify the authenticity of the documents, but it will definitely affect the final decree. Will I get a chance to talk? Yes, but I'd be very careful about what I say if I were you. The hearing went pretty much as Mike had said it would. Amy was given the house, the kids, and temporary alimony. I was ordered to pay Amy half of what I had removed from checking and savings, but some of the certificates of deposit got overlooked, and I certainly didn't mention them. Amy's attorney tried to get the judge to order me to pay his fees, but Mike objected. This is not a case of my client suing for divorce and his wife having to respond. In this case, she sued my client and he only responded. Since his wife initiated the action, she should be responsible for her own legal costs. The judge agreed with us on that one, and it brought a bit of a smile to my face. When the judge, following the advice of Child Protective Services, set the child support, Mike objected and presented the DNA test documents showing that I was not the biological father of the kids. I was ordered to pay temporary child support pending CPS's verification of the documents. If the documents proved to be true, any support I had paid would be deducted from my wife's share of the distribution. I watched Amy when Mike brought up the paternity of the kids, and she didn't show any surprise. The witch knew all along. When it came to the end, the judge asked me if I fully understood the orders of the court. I understand what you said, but I don't understand why my adulterous wife is being allowed custody of the children.